Well, I'm very honored to be invited. This is my first time here. And also, it's somewhat unusual for someone working mostly on very historical topic to think about the evolution of institutions. I think in this case, maybe I was actually scratching my head when I was invited to think about what I should be speaking, something that's relevant to contemporary globalization issues. And given China had its very, very own particular worldview about the world order. So what I'm going to do today is actually much more going quite a bit historical. So will be something fairly different, looking at the particular view that China used to have historically, and that I would argue is actually very important to understand what's going on today and some of the things that will, even though it may not be there all the time. So let me follow this very important fact in Chinese long-run economic history and people comparing China with Europe. This has been going on for a long, long time, is the fact that China remained unified as a single state for a long, long time, where Europe was much more fragmented. This has huge implications for what we think about as globalization today. It's not that China doesn't have its world order, it does, but it works in a very, very different way. I think the best probably way of thinking about at the time when the Roman Empire collapsed, which was about the same time as the Han Chinese Empire, that's about 200 AD and so on. And there's various efforts in Europe trying to revive the empire and build, the idea of Holy Roman Empire was only there, but it never really succeeded. We think about, maybe Nazi Germany tried or Napoleon tried and never succeeded. But what was happening with China was very interesting. When the Han Chinese Empire collapsed, there was this periods of disintegration. Eventually, it got back to a single empire, what we are seeing today, especially, which I talk about modern period, where we see the rise of single Chinese empire. So the consequence of this is quite interesting. A lot of people think about 1 billion Chinese people. That's really, really a lot of people. But they are really in one place, right? You have overseas Chinese, that's a fairly different story. Whereas if you think about Europe as the descendants of Europe, they have spread all 3 different continents. We're talking about colonies here and so on. So that particular political structure has huge implications for the way the empire spread and also for the way the globalization was shaped today. So, this is just a very quick graphics about number of sovereign states. If you look at this, China, basically it's collapsed into one state. And the European states, well, whatever the states in Europe is disintegrated. I think it's kind of integrating a little bit towards, but still it's concentrated several different states, which has huge implications. That's the thing I want to stress later on. That has to do, is in some sense constructed a particular Chinese view of world order, was you have the ideal of a single state with a single emperor, and that's something very, very important. The world order is based on something called under the heaven, right? The entire the Chinese word, the idea of nation states, the Chinese word is actually state families. The word family is under there as well. And internally, this is very important, which means local autonomy remained a residual. Some of the things you can compare, thinking about the US federalism, where the states were independent. In China, there was the adoption of a bureaucratic system, which basically almost all the countries were run by people directly appointed by the emperor. Okay, that's something we also know the very well-known civil service examination, which is using impersonal bureaucrats and so on. So that's something that's very, very important. You do not have anything the equivalent of a city-states like we see in Europe. To a certain degree, the top-down institution in China is much more important. Not that there is no bottom-up institutions. We talk about civil society to a certain degree also existing, but it's something what I would call a bit of a residual. There is the idea of international order. That's some of you may have heard the idea of a tributary order. That it's not exactly a nation-states framework. It's something how close you were. One of the very interesting examples is the status Korea in Chinese history. It is one of the very typical tributary state, right? It is, it's actually, somebody would say it is a semi-Chinese state and so on. The evolution of this is quite interesting. One of the striking feature, again, think about this is China's world order because it's relatively isolated. Like, Barry was saying that China was at the eastmost end of the Eurasian Empire. So you have the Great Wall, that's mostly the agrarian region, and the other areas, the nomadic regions. So it's a bit of a clash of civilization between those two places that may have pushed the integration together. This remained a very defining feature of the Chinese empire, is what's called the mirror empires. The empires were fighting, part of the research I've been doing is to look at the state formation. Let me give you some example. One of the consequences of this is the increasingly highly homogeneous cultural assimilation that happened. This is a map of today. This is the region where the largest Han Chinese, 93% of the Chinese claim they are of a single ethnic group, which is really remarkable for 1 billion people. And this is the people speaking Han Chinese language. And you can see that corresponds very well with that, the Great Wall line and that agrarian regions being, it's the same bureaucratic system that have been practiced. You see a little bit spread up here. That's after the 19th century when the Manchu was opened up to Chinese migration and so on. You can see, so that has huge impact on the integration of Chinese empire. This is the last empire, the Qing Empire, and this is the Ming territory. You can see the Ming is largely Han Chinese empire. And the Qing was slowly expanding. This is where the hometown of the Manchu rulers coming from. They expanded into Tibet, expanded into Mongolia, and all of that. Now, one of the things that is very, very important to understand this Chinese imperial expansion is, some other work we all compare with, say, let's say, the British imperial expansion. For a long time, the fighting was between these two places. So Chinese were obsessed with the northern frontier. They were not thinking about the coastal frontier, there's the Pacific Ocean. All those things were relatively not that important. Most of these expansions were not for natural resource, for anything, for revenue. Most of the expansions for political stability. So this is something that is at the top of every Chinese state leader's agenda is political stability. If there's a source of instability, they will go there. Unlike if you think about the British colonization of India through East Indian Company, political stability, the threat from India was zero to the British Empire, but the natural resource was the driving force of it. So this is the time when 1842, it's very, very well known in Chinese history, when Britain launched the Opium War, a war that actually largely forgotten in most parts by, I don't think talking to many British people, they were recognized, but this war has really defined the Chinese landscape. Now, the thing that's very important, you have an empire that sets itself centered, certainly challenged by a power that's coming from here, which has never challenged China before. So this is a very, very big shock. To a certain degree, we can talk about the long-run influence of this. Is the city of Shanghai, which is very important because to some degree talking about globalization, this became the financial center of this particular river area in Shanghai. But this is a city that was largely inhabited initially by the British residents and British business, and there's also a little bit the French as well as the Chinese. But this is a city with 3 governments, something that China had never seen on its territory, with all the innovations, all the things that were coming out of it. What sometimes I would argue, certainly the monetary financial revolution happened in the early 20th century. We think of today HSBC, we think of today, we know the Bank of China is the largest bank, but actually started as a government bank, then privatized precisely the heydays is in those periods. This is all the time of political weakness. This is something, a graph that was very, very famous is the carving up of China. It's all the different imperial powers in the early 20th century where the idea of taking advantage of Chinese weakness is to divide up China. And particularly notice the Japanese images here. This is when Japan was rising. I'm saying this because this is really a very, very big challenge to the entire mindset of the Chinese world order. And what happened afterwards, story that we know relatively well, is the rise of nationalism and so eventually communism. This becomes a very important part of the rhetoric of even the government today, is the idea that China had gone through a century of humiliation. The idea of Chinese rejuvenation to some degree is to revive a Chinese state. Perhaps it's a historical glory, but that was quite different. So what is the lesson here, probably? Now, I think one of the things that we have to be a bit mindful, that one thing that's really striking, you do not see empire of this size with this kind of degree of homogeneity. The written language is unified, even though you have dialects and so on. So you have what we come close to a very much shared culture and common shared identity. But there's also other things that are coming to the globalization. The idea, the rhetoric keep coming back. And this is something that China did very badly, or at least they interpret that way, in the first or second wave of globalization. China was the victim of globalization. And how do they deal with it? I mean, one thing that we probably need to, it's very, very interesting when Xi Jinping was talking about the Chinese dream. What is in the Chinese dream? As you know, that one of the things, he went to the National Museum with all the party, his entire entourage. They were looking at all these photos, most of these photos about century of humiliation. That's why Xi Jinping was stopping there. But this is China that needs to rejuvenate. So this is, I think, giving us some kind of background, this very complex picture, the view of the Chinese world order, something maybe we need to be very mindful when we think about China today. Thank you very much.